Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to have you join us today for this webinar with three wonderful colleagues who we've brought together with the support of the MacArthur Foundation, and we're very appreciative of them having a program where they reunite fellows that they've supported over the years, and invite groups like us, ACLS, to bring them together for a particular reason. These are busy, fascinating people, and having a chance to come together. They don't have reunions, but I think having an excuse to talk about something that's of interest to them and of interest to all of you and interest to us at ACLS is a great opportunity. So we're appreciative of MacArthur's support, and really appreciative of the time of Professors Foreman, Jones, and Miller to spend some time with us today. So I'm James Shulman. I'm Vice President at the American Council of Learned Societies, where, as our name indicates, we're a 104-year-old organization put together by a number of what are now ACLS member societies. There are now 80 societies, some which are discipline focused, like the American Historical Association, others that are reaching across disciplines and across fields with a particular approach to a time period or a subject matter. And we work with them. We carry out a series of fellowship and regranting programs, some from our own endowment, many with the support of other foundations. And more recently, we have a series of projects that are really focused around institutional infrastructure that support the humanities and social sciences, the fields that we spend our time working in. So these programs range from a commission that we've convened with the support of the National Endowment of the Humanities and the Mellon Foundation on fostering and sustaining digital projects associated with racial and social justice. So that's a national commission where scholars and librarians and archivists and administrators get together and are going to issue a report and some recommendations about the support of this kind of 21st century humanities. We also have another program supported by Mellon called the Intention Foundry, where led by my colleague Javon Bickerstaff, where we bring together early career scholars and the executive directors of the academic societies to really workshop what the needs of the next generation of scholars are from the society, so that it's not that boards and executive directors aren't left with sort of a star chamber. We know everything that should be done in these fields because we're experienced and caring, but really to bring together the voices and the presence of early career scholars. So a lot of this work is really about institutional evolution to support humanistic scholarship. And I wanted to start off today by thinking a little bit about institutions. Institutions, of course, exist in a lot of ways to conserve the past and conserve ideas and pass them along to the next generation. But of course, in their mode of being conserving and conservative, they also have to adapt and evolve. And so really one of the questions that frames why we brought together a set of MacArthur Fellows is to help us think about evolution of how institutions work, what the rules of the game are of institutions. And this term, the rules of the game, is something that sociologists actually use a lot, that lots of things, lots of structures in society have their own rules. They have their own norms. They might be not, sort of completely legible to people outside of the game. And of course, institutions of higher education have their rules. And so thinking about how they use those rules to conserve things in very good and important ways, and also how those rules adapt over time. So when we think about institutions, we think about first, obviously, like vertical institutions, colleges and universities. we're lucky in this country that we have thousands of them. Almost more than 3,500 nonprofit, and then there's certainly for-profit institutions as well. And these are institutions that are organized vertically in the sense that they're often a campus or a series of campuses tied together, and they do a lot of things on their own. And within institutions, as we know, there are sub-institutions. So if you're the University of Michigan, I think the University of Michigan libraries or the Department of Chemistry have their own rules of the game that fit within this other vertical institution of what others might think of as one institution. At the same time, there are horizontal institutions that reach across. So when we talk about our member societies, if the Modern Language Association or the American Sociological Association issues guidelines for thinking about what kind of work is rewarded, what kind of work should be thought of as scholarship within the field, that's sort of a horizontal institution that's reaching across those 3,500 vertical institutions. So all of these forces, these institutional forces, help us understand the rules of the games of particular disciplines and particular fields, and what gets rewarded, what doesn't get rewarded. Our thought in inviting Kellie Jones and Gabrielle Foreman and Peter Miller here with us today is that these are scholars who have been recognized by this longstanding and wonderful program at the MacArthur Foundation for their inventiveness, for their creativity in their work. And so we wanted to think about whether creative, inventive scholars, and of course, all scholars are creative, inventive. These are just a few outstanding examples. How their creative, inventive work interacts with institutions that are, again, by their nature, tending to conserve, pass along, and at the same time, evolve and adapt with the times. So you've read their introductions a little bit in our introductory slides, but I wanted to ask each of you maybe to start off by saying a little bit about your work, and maybe saying a little bit about whether you think it fits well into a box. Is there a box that makes a lot of sense that your work has fit in? And so describe your work a little bit, and then maybe talk about whether it's always been on sort of the straight and narrow. And I think maybe with alphabetical order, I'll start with Gabrielle Foreman.
I grew up with little boxes full of ticky-tacky, being the way in which I think about boxes in many ways. The ways in which we don't fit into them personally, the way I don't fit into them personally. I was a under-resourced economic kid who was in elite institutions as a young person. I was religiously, I didn't fit into any boxes. Racially, I fit into many boxes. And so not being in boxes is a comfortable place for me. I think this probably resonates with lots of people who are in this larger Zoom room. And that has been true for professionally as well, certainly. So my degrees are all interdisciplinary. I then found homes in English departments, although I have no English degrees at all for many, many years. I'm a literary historian by training, but I've always really been driven by collective work, by collective research, and now by collective and digital research. So that landed me in a place where I thought about institutional affiliation and 5-year planning. I've always been a kind of long-term planner as well. And that I think also came from being in a place where economically I had to have plans to move forward. If I didn't, there wasn't a fallback. So those 5-year plans turned into 10-year plans that always included how can I work with communities and how can I work collaboratively and collectively. And so identifying values, you'll hear me say again and again and again, is the ways in which I made professional decisions. And now I am a co-director with a group of 35 to 50, depending on how you count it, scholars, graduate student leaders, archivists, arts partners, who are part of what we call DIG Black or DIG Black, the Center for Black Digital Research, which stands for Digitize Black Records, Dignify Black Scholarship, dig or excavate Black history, and love Black people. We create collections of Black records from the largest and longest early movement of African-American organizing. It's called the Colored Conventions Project. Our newest project is called the Early Black Women's Organizing Archive. And then we also celebrate Douglas Day and have resurrected this as a holiday where we invite people globally to be involved in a global transcribe-a-thon of Black records on Douglas's chosen birthday, which also happens to be February 14th. So we call it a day of global love for Black history, since he chose Valentine's Day as his birthday, since he was an enslaved man who did not know exactly when he was born. So I think that can get us started. And James, pass it on to whomever you like.
Great, thank you. That, as you say, that's not a small box, not one box. Kellie Jones, Professor Jones.
Great to be here with everyone. I think Gabrielle has really laid it out. I think there was no box for me, and now there is because I made it. That's what I've always said. When I got to college, I always feel like a very boring person because I got to college and I really wanted to be a diplomat. And then I kind of, being one of the first women to integrate a all-male school was difficult enough. And then I realized, maybe the diplomat, I had to rethink it. So I had gone to an arts high school in New York, now called LaGuardia, then called Music and Art. And so I fell back on my art training, even though I said I would never want to be an artist because, I'll just starve to death. But then I realized there was a space for people to document, to curate, to, interview, write about people. And I started doing that as an undergraduate. And also interested in Latin American and Latinx art history. I could not do that. I had to actually make up a major because you couldn't really have a major where you focused on African American, African diaspora, or Latinx artists. And Gabrielle and I attended the same college. But so I made it up, and I say, so that's why I say I'm boring. I've been doing the same thing ever since. I made up that box by creating an interdisciplinary major at Amherst College. And this is why I'm a big fan of liberal arts colleges that allow you to experiment, that allow you to make up something, as all of us have, and, define it. Years later, I'm now teaching for many years courses on all of this. And these are kind of standard courses that you can find throughout the country, not everywhere, but you can find more of it now. Before I became a professor, though, I was a curator. And that's what I became interested in doing as a way to define or tell the histories, tell the stories, uncover all these stories of all the artists I grew up with. Like Gabrielle, I have poets as parents, and I knew a lot of artists growing up and went to an arts high school. So I knew a lot of artists growing up in an urban New York setting, where at that time, most of the people in the school were people of color. And so, but it was always strange to me that when you are reading the history, even in high school, there's no people of color in it, except they're very ancient, they're Mesoamericans, they're Egyptians, but there's nobody in the 20th century. And I knew so many painters and artists. And so I really started by interviewing them. and asking them about themselves. And I realized this was something that was needed. And I went into that. And then, another kind of barrier presented itself when I got out into the world and I was trying to get to, the major institutions, and I couldn't. I was working at community art centers, which are, I love them, but you could never rise above that, or not rise above, but move on to another space. So I said, okay, I'm going to go get a PhD, because then they're going to have to let me run something in a larger museum space. By the time I got to the end of that, I had the opportunity to teach. And I said, because my goal was to just take the PhD and go back into the museum world. But then I said, well, let me just, try this. And if I don't like it, I can always go back into the museum world. And then I decided that actually it was the ideas that I like more than the administration in museums. And then I could still do for many years. After I got my degree, I was still, even in graduate school, curating shows. And then about 10 years ago, the museums realized they should actually hire people rather than hire me per project. And so, again, when I say I've been creating these boxes or creating space for myself, creating the boxes, this is absolutely what has happened.
Great. Professor Miller.
Thanks very much. And it's a pleasure being here and listening to my colleagues. The question of boxes is a little bit, I think, misleading, with all respect, because it's all about where you're standing, right? From 35,000 feet, literally or figuratively, we're all together. The boxes just become visible the closer up you go. So, I now run an organization, and on the board, there are artists and scholars. It doesn't really matter what kind of artist you are, what kind of scholar, the box is there, but it's a very capacious box. It only gets to be a troubling box when it gets very small and constraining. So I'm not sure I believe really in the boxes at all. And it's true that my career has been, in some sense, dogged by the problem of boxes. I wrote a book about opera while I was supposedly writing a PhD about English political thought. And that posed a real problem for getting a job, because entry-level positions are narrowly construed, and departments don't want people who don't fit in them because they're afraid they'll be ungovernable or they won't stay long enough. So it took a long time to get a job. And and then I quickly abandoned the very legible subject of my dissertation for an illegible and unwieldy topic that took me 25 years to work on, and was really all about uncovering obscure people who had been forgotten because of the very way the historical profession developed, making those people and their activities invisible. So professionally, that was not a great move. At the time, I was aware that it was something I wanted to do, but those people, which included at the time my mother, who had more common sense than I, warned me that this was, a road into the wilderness, that one should only travel if one carried a lot of pitchers of water with you. And I had to wait a long time. It took me 8 years to get a job. So I think I understand your question very well. I don't think really the situation has changed that much at the entry level. But for myself, that trip into the wilderness was enormously productive, not only for the pleasure of the work that it gave me, but also because it ended up giving me a different vision of how things worked. And I mean things in two different ways. In terms of scholarship, it made me understand that the very notion of a box is totally conventional, that we could easily reimagine history in terms of a kind of, and I've written about this, a genus of the past lovers or archaeophiles that would include not only historians, but poets and conservators and curators and historical reenactors and artists. I mean, it's a big group of people, architects. We create these little boxes and put us in, but those are historically very contingent facts. And then I had the chance to be the dean of an institution that didn't fit into any box, that was created for subject matter that didn't fit into any box. And it was a kind of fun, if ironic, fact that a person who was rebelling against the profession got a chance to run an institution. And that was great fun. And I guess I'm a believer in institutions, or rather, I would say I'm a believer in the power of institutions. It is the case that most of the time they are managed. They are managed not with the belief that they are there to change the future, but rather to be carriers of a legacy. But the fact is, institutions are super powerful. You can accomplish much more as an intellectual running an institution than you can as an intellectual writing books and articles. Because institutions are big and they have on their Instagram feeds a lot bigger readership than I will ever have.
So this is great, and there's so many directions to follow. But Peter, just if you will, just say a little bit about the Bard Graduate Center, because you alluded to it and why it made it an unusual institution.
So just very briefly, I mean, the history of art history, just to use that as an example, emerged out of archaeology. It took as its starting points first sculpture, monumental sculpture, then paintings and architecture, and increasingly left out not only, of course, objects of daily use. Those got filtered out pretty quickly, but also small three-dimensional objects were left out, and both became the domain of amateur scholars or collectors and connoisseurs. And that was the case for those who studied material culture, but also the different media in which art objects were made, whether we're talking about wood or metal, glass, ceramic, furniture. You couldn't study those in an art history department. So the Bard Graduate Center was created, in a sense, because of a box, right? And then once it was created, when I got a chance to be the dean, what I saw was that this problem of the decorative arts was, in fact, just a special case of a much bigger problem that had to do with the broader category of how we can understand the past through things, for which we needed the tools not only of art historians, but also archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, chemists. You could go on and on. So that was the sort of the move, was to take the problem up to a still higher level of abstraction, where you could get a purchase on a much bigger category. And then what you did is much more important than just prying open the doors of one field, but actually of many.
Well, that sort of unboxing the object and starting with the object and seeing what tools of the discipline or various disciplines can be used to listen to the object, right? And it's interesting. I mean, thinking of Gabrielle and that team that you described on Ditch Black, it's not, a historian or an archivist or a coder or a database admin. Say a little bit about what it takes to do the work and expand the box or build the new box that you were talking about.
I often say that my pronouns are she, but they really are we, are, ours. And that's because the collective work that we can do together is so much more powerful, in the same ways that Professor Miller said that institutions have a broader reach than the essay or the monograph. Collective work just has broader synergistic and reach than and interdisciplinary reach and tentacles. The elemental nature of the work, the ways or the compound nature of the work, the ways in which right? Molecules come together to create something so much larger, more complicated, more intricate, more interesting, more generative, more, to use Professor Miller's word, capacious, is fundamental to the kinds of work that I have been engaged in for the entirety of my career. Technologists and archivists and people who create collections come out of, in the work that I do, buried histories. In the same way that Dr. Jones was talking about the fact that the history of curatorial work that becomes visible in institutions of art history had excluded the kinds of works and questions that she was interested in engaging, illuminating, and building upon. So when we began to think about the ways in which we could put together so many records of a whole historical movement, 70 years of Black political organizing that so few people knew about, we wanted to think about the ways it could be legible and accessible for large audiences, which meant pushing against all kinds of taxonomies and categories, including material ones that exclude folks with paywalls, right? So we created a website, coloredconventions.org, and then collections of documents. But I'm a literary historian. What do I know about how to organize collections? But digital technologists know something about that. Archivists know something about that, right? Their front-end designers know how to make that inviting. People who, but then we're not just interested in the records, we're also always interested in the stories that those records tell. And we made decisions that were based on principles. So we articulated our principles fairly early on to name everyone, to be involved in pipeline work that not only was about crediting people, but paying people for their work and their labor, particularly when we were including graduate students and undergraduate workers and artists, right? And then we thought about how can we engage a larger populace? So we started telling both digital stories digitally in relationship to digital exhibits, and we worked with scholars, and we continue to work with scholars all over the North America, which is where the vast majority of these conventions were held, in order to create digital exhibits. So a team in California created an extraordinary exhibit on California political organizing and conventions. A group in Illinois, headed up by Kate Masser, whose work was just nominated for a Pulitzer, I believe, or a National Book Award. They just created an amazing exhibit on Black organizing in Illinois. We have exhibits on the Black press, which are all intricately connected to 70 years of Black organizing, which very few of us knew about, which was both embedded in the abolitionist movement and overshadowed by the abolitionist movement, and lasted for 30 more years than that. So we created digital exhibits, and then we created curriculum. But what do I know about curriculum, right? So we brought in teaching partners and people who do work in creating curricula for high school students. And then we started presenting on this, and we brought more and more people in. We thought we wanted to transcribe them so they could be freely available. And we wanted the transcriptions not just to be done by people who have time and are already interested in the enterprise of preserving history. We wanted the cultural descendants of the history itself to be involved. So we partnered with the AME Church and brought in thousands of transcribers from the AME Church, where so many of the conventions themselves had been held, in order to transcribe the living histories of their own organizations and their own buildings, congregations, churches. So we've been very intentional about slowing down our work and broadening our community. This began in Philadelphia in 1830. It goes on through the 1890s. And we really thought carefully about how we wanted it to be known in the city where it was built. So we partnered with Mural Arts Philadelphia and created the first two murals about the conventions and the first public art to deal with that. The ways in which we can engage with artists who are the cultural storytellers, the griots of our history, right? Kellie is very generous. My father worked with hers, but I mean, her father was one of the great storytellers of our country. And to think through the ways in which people put that history on stage, right? From, for many centuries, in many ways, right? Over many cultures, history has been told through the poets and the playwrights, through the visual artists, those who create material artifacts, not just those who create archives, collections, records. And we were interested in engaging those multiple audiences. And as Dr. Miller suggested, when one pulls out, right, not just thinking about Black history in the 19th century, but thinking about the ways in which humans communicate the importance of their values and the importance of social justice and civil rights, right, that is a constant in the struggle, at least against institutions and governments and countries that impede on those human rights. We see the kinds of similarities, right, and the ways in which the similarities and the ways in which those histories have also been dampened down, right? And we've been engaged in a collective initiative, a collective connection to those in history that we've inherited in order to bring those histories to light in the specific instances which are our subject and which are our passion.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story of, in one sense, institution building to make up for what the institutions had excluded, right? I mean, and both in terms of the collecting of the materials, the recognition of the people and the story, and so, but you haven't. Your story that you're telling is not one of just thinking about the material, or in some sense, you're thinking about every aspect of that story, and of who needs to be involved, who can help build it, who should be rewarded for building, who should be recognized in the building of it. It's as if, I mean, like, the University of Bologna was created in 12 whatever, and now you have to create a part of that institution, a field and a subject, and a history and a primary source collection and an audience for it, all rapidly. And and in doing so, you haven't left anyone out. You recognize that that again, that box is not a small one. That box includes a lot of people and a lot of work and a lot of stories that matter, right? And so I want to go back to a phrase that Professor Miller used earlier when he talked about his 8 years of making it harder to find a job or get his first job or get that job because of the range of work he was doing. You talked about your mother saying, carry a lot of water if you're going to go into the wilderness. So, Professor Jones, was your time in curating? I mean, you weren't thinking of ending up in higher education anyway. So, but was that time? It was time outside of the institutions that you're now in. Was that time in the wilderness, or was that time? What was that time in terms of not being in the sort of ethos, the environment ecology where you are now?
Well, I had no sights on being in this space. I was where I wanted to be. I was in New York, the center of the art world. And I was a young person working in institutions that were nonprofit institutions. I was working at Studio Museum in Harlem. I worked at the National Endowment for the Arts. I worked at the Jamaica Art Center in Queens. So I was working in institutional settings that actually gave me a lot of freedom to do what I wanted. And I was showing the work of artists of color. It was the 80s. I was having a blast. I had no, the only thing that started to change was that I started wanting to do more, or I started wanting to articulate it a bit better. And I said, okay, I'm going to have to get another degree. Did I want to go into, at that time, museum directors had to have MBAs, right? So it was a choice between an MBA and a PhD. And I kept going back and forth. And I realized, you know what, MBA is about business. I'm not really a business-minded person. I'm kind of the ideas person. I was writing a lot. I was working full time, but I was also doing exhibitions on the side at other places. And that's when I decided that I would get a PhD. And only later did I, even consider this institutional space, because it was really a means to an end. It was really a professional degree to allow me to go back into the museum world. But as I said, when I got to the end of it, and there was a very good job at the end that I was really encouraged to apply for. And I did, and I got it. And then I said, okay, I'm going to just try this, really not even knowing about kind of academic administration or actually the rules of, how do you get tenure? And I think at that time, certainly in a lot of these, spaces, it wasn't very clear. Now you have a lot more training as to do this, do that, do this, do that. So I was kind of just going along, and but I did know that if you're going to be in a research one, you need to have 2 books, right? That exhibitions are not going to count towards that. Exhibitions, as I began to see, as I continued to do them, because people kept calling me, and I said, well, I can always use this money, or I can always, do this because it was an exciting project. Even when I was in graduate school, I got called to do the Johannesburg Biennale. That's a chance of a lifetime. You don't turn that down. If you've never been to South Africa, you're a graduate student, you're going to do it. So eventually I saw that you could actually do these things, and that they would be meaningful and they would count after you had your books. Then they would be all of a sudden revealed. It's like they come from behind the curtain, on Let's Make a Deal or something like that. Voila, look at what else she's done, But before that, you had to play by the rules. And I think as a writer, I was comfortable with that. But the other part that was maybe the boxy part that I still kept pushing against was that coming from a family of writers, like almost everybody in my family is a writer, and they just have a whole different approach to writing and what writing is. So if I get in the academy and they tell me writing is this, and I'm like, who said? Writing is this. Writing is not what you tell me it is. Writing is what I've grown up writing and what my parents write, and they're kind of highly acclaimed people. And so is my sister, by the way, and my other sister is a journalist, in media, and they're highly acclaimed. So how can you tell me there's only one message, one way to do things? So I was always kind of bumping up against that. But I got to a place where it worked out. I got to a place where, coming back to New York, I guess a dream job, people always ask me, what was that your dream job? I said, well, I guess so. Teaching art history in New York is not a bad thing, as Professor Miller might agree. So I think that allowed me, and the timing, to, I want to say, I guess I made some interventions, but not consciously always pushing. I was just insistent that writing and knowledge was more than what people wanted to say. Academic knowledge is this thing and all other knowledge is this thing, because my parents were also teachers. They were also working in higher education. So, what I just kept doing my thing, and it worked.
Professor Foreman.
I just want to pick up on this question of order that both Professor Jones and Professor Miller have talked a little bit about. And I love the way in which Kellie suggested or described it, right? Like, that it's that once you've got the things that count, then the other things that didn't count all of a sudden count, right? So I love that description, the way you described it. But I have graduate students now and people in their careers who I'm affiliated with who are doing all the things that they want to do, have all of the opportunities in front of them that Professor Jones just described, and who are being hounded by that's not the right word, are being more than gently encouraged by their institutions to finish the PhD right now. So they figured out compensation. They're getting compensated fairly well. They're doing the exciting work that the PhD is going to allow them to do, is supposed to allow them to do. They're doing it before they get the PhD, along the way. They know program officers. They're creating digital projects with endowed professors and with established professors, and they're part of the leadership team. They're creating curriculum. They're giving presentations at National History Day, right? But at the same time, they're being treated as if this work somehow doesn't count because it's distracting them from finishing the PhD. And so or distracting you from getting the real job, right? Or distracting you from coming up for full, right? All of those. So the metrics of the university and the timeline of the university somehow stand in with a resonant sort of power we're all supposed to respect, the actual things that you want to do in the world that are transformative and powerful, right? And so, yes, we always want to pay attention to structures, but we also don't want them to obscure and overshadow the importance of the work, right? The importance of the opportunities, the importance of the collectives, right? And I think we really do need, and the we that I use here is the larger we of those of us who are in the academy, the deans who are in the room. So many of them signed up, I saw, right? Vice provosts in the room, chairs in the room, right? Need to, I think, begin to think more capaciously about the work, the audience, the impact, the transformational power of the work that people in their departments, in their institutions, that they're doing. And I'd say this to foundations too. Why does a PI have to be a full professor? Why? Right? So Jessica Marie Johnson was a senior person in digital humanities way before she got tenure. She was doing transformative work. I bet you she's on your console. She may be a leader on your console, right? Like, I mean, there are these people who are doing extraordinary work, right? And it just takes a moment for the metrics of the university to catch up. They're not behind. We're behind as the imposers of metrics, right? In recognizing the artificial inherited, right, structure over the transformative work.
We want the creativity, and yet we're not so enthusiastic. We want the person to take on that risk, right? Like, we want you to take these risks, and if you succeed, we're going to be thrilled with you. And success, of course, is this interplay between how we deem success and the success that you're building by creating something new, right? So in the meanwhile, that risk falls upon the person, upon the adventurer, right? I'm going to pursue what I am passionate about, and then, as you say, the sort of judicious or even protective instinct of the advisor is, yes, but do that later, or do it on your own time. Do what you must do first, right? And then, yeah, when is the time for that? Like, if all of that's suppressed, like, when is the time for that? Professor Miller.
Yeah, I warned Gabrielle, Professor Foreman, that I was at some point going to come out as the institutionalist in our conversation, and I think this might be the moment. So, universities have been around for 800 years. And probably with the papacy, they're the oldest going institutional operation in the European and wider European worlds. And it's survived because it lags, right? It's not trying to be up to date. So in a way, I love the way you posed your challenge, but the university determines its policies for, let's say, doctoral students, not based on the world outside, but in terms of the university, because universities exist to reproduce themselves. They exist to produce the next generation of teachers. And they're always looking back as they generate that future. So I'm not surprised that they have systems like dissertations have to be original work that can't have been published as a book before. That makes perfect sense in terms of what universities are trying to do with the production of the next generation of students. And I take your point that it sits athwart those doctoral students who can get out in the world and really start running already. So two things. One is, I actually think that almost anything that forces students, young faculty members, to be passionate about their subject and to really strive is better. It's like forcing a plant. It's going to make it hardier and more successful. That's the first thing. But the second is, I think it's absolutely right to see a need for institutions to reflect more. So just to give you an example, and when the two of you are really talking about exhibitions, it struck home because at Bard, we have an exhibition program. And when I took over as dean, I was really surprised to see that we didn't give faculty credit for working on exhibitions in our own institution. So I waited a little bit, but once we launched what was explicitly a faculty-student exhibition program, where faculty were going to make exhibitions out of their own research, and we wanted them to do this, there was no way that we could have gotten buy-in if we maintained the old policy. At the same time, we had also started a digital media lab. So both of those focused attention on precisely what we're talking about, or Gabrielle, you were talking about, and that's collaborative work, which was such a kind of bugbear in the humanities. Of course, not for the sciences and not even for the social sciences. They've solved that all. But so what we did is we revised the faculty handbook. And we tried to get away from the easy, off-the-rack, one book, two book solution. And instead, we tried to think about sort of phenomenologically, what is a monograph and why do we so value it? And we extracted the excellences that for which the monograph was just an external manifestation. And we said, these are the things we are seeking in tenure and promotion or for promotion to full. And you can demonstrate that, the possession of these, in any number of formats. So I really think it might be a question of just thinking harder about the problem instead of being lazy.
Professor Jones.
I would also just say that, thinking into the future, as we've also been asked to do, that the digital has to come into play because it's here and we need it. And as Gabrielle was saying, we can reach so many more people with knowledge with this. But I would also say, I don't want to abandon books in this moment when books are being banned. I think we still have to hold on and hug a book. However it fits in, it's amazing some of the books that are banned, as you all know. Art history books, history of African-American history, histories of African-American photography, banned. Why? So I think there's a place where we have to still hold on to that. But one of the exciting things for me in doing, and yes, exhibitions are about collaboration. They're about reaching different people with your research. I was working on a book now called South of Pico. I ran into somebody who was very excited. Well, are you going to do a show? Yeah, eventually. They called me 2 weeks later. Is your book done? Because let's do a show. And so the show actually came up, now called Now Dig This, at the Hammer, part of Pacific Standard Time now, over a decade ago. I can't even believe it. And it allowed me to do exactly what Gabrielle was talking about. Create archives, give archives back to the artists, give them high-res images, get into their archives, get into museum archives, which might be a little bit harder. You know, if I just said I was a researcher, they would be like, or get into their storage. They would be like, okay, but if you're going to do a show, well, yes, it's open to you. So there was that. But the one of the wonderful things, the show traveled to 3 sites, to start at the Hammer, went to MoMA PS1, and then went to the Williams College Museum of Art. So all the programming that we had along with that was then collected along with the catalog essays and put on a site which still exists, which I teach when I teach my African-American artists in the 20th and 21st centuries, as I'm teaching this semester. I use that site because it exists as a research site, because as we know, exhibitions are ephemeral. You know, when you are a guest curator, you don't own that. You own your text, right? If you say, I have a copyright on my text, you can't have a copyright on an exhibition, or you can't, the museum doesn't allow you to own that, right? So, but it doesn't really matter, because if the images are there, they're downloadable, they're beautiful, they're essays, they're programs with people, some of whom have passed away, that are still online now, 10 years later, because of the digital. I value that so much, to have that available for students, for researchers, for people all over the world.
Well, and you also raised the increasingly pressing point about how society looks at these fields, these subjects. I mean, we have laws now coming up in more than 25 states against explicit efforts at diversifying our curriculum and our faculty. So I think when we think about the book, I mean, there's one thing, there's the long form argument, which all of you have published books, and their books are wonderful. And then there's the question of access and approachable access to these fields that you're still building, and to the understanding of why and how these subjects of study are important as subjects that have been studied for 2,000 years. And yet, so I think that what you're saying about the digital presence, the public writing, the publicly accessible writing, the exhibition, these are all modes of, as Professor Miller was saying, of conveying the knowledge that you're pursuing, right? And they're ways of conveying that knowledge to a broader society who is going to vote on these state legislators who are going to write these bills. So I think there's lots of communication of this to be done, right? And so the book is one mode, and these are exhibitions and digital presence and articles and publicly accessible writing are also valid ways of conveying your expertise. And sometimes they fit into a reward structure, as Professor Miller was talking about the handbook. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes those evolve kind of slowly. Let me ask about a word that's come up. I think all of you have used it in various ways, and that's about visibility and invisibility. We've talked about how certain work that you've done, which may not fit into the box of a particular academic progression, becomes visible after the fact, right? It becomes legitimate after you've already been appraised in terms of the traditional measures. But also subject matter. Professor Miller talked about historical figures and historical thought that was worthy of bringing into visibility that in Western canonical subjects, right, in Western European characters, but for making them visible. What are the risks of, and of course, the colored conventions, as Professor Foreman was saying, we're deliberately left out of the visible canon, right? Deliberately left out of collection building. The artists that Professor Jones curated, brought together. So, what are the risks of deciding to invest your time and your energy and your passion in making the invisible visible? Professor Foreman.
Instead of maybe talking about the risks, I'm just going to turn that question 30 degrees or maybe 40 degrees and ask the question instead, how do we mitigate the risks or create conditions of success for the work that we want to do? And one of the things that Dr. Jones talked about was coming out of a graduate student training and then having the perfect job waiting for her, and in New York, right? And that kind of serendipity and hard work and recognition for the work that she had already done landed her in that place. Sometimes I think we need to think about choices we make when we don't have that option. And those choices, our choices in the academy, in institutions, are often structured around stature. So when Dr. Miller's mom said, when you go right into the wilderness, bring water, right? She was saying, I don't know your mom, Dr. Miller, right? When you move away from centers of power, right, and recognition and stature, make sure you pack some jerky, right, and some water. But there are loads of different kinds of institutions, and I think matching institutions' values and resources is something that we might think about when we are invested in doing the kind of work we want to do in much more serious terms than the stature of institutions, which llama la atención tanto, right? Like that literally holds so much power and call to us. And that our advisors often are invested in, and that structurally institutions have to, right? They want their graduate students to go on to R1 institutions so that their departments will still have a certain level of stature, right? I mean, institutions are also in the business of replicating their stature, right? So I chose to go to Wayne State in my first job. I had lots of different options. I went to a working class institution in the middle of Detroit that had a 2-2 teaching load and working class students, and paid me as much as other institutions were going to pay me. So the resources, both my teaching load, right, and the economic resources and the resources of the city itself were available to me, right? But the stature of the institution did not compare conventionally to other options that I could have executed. But I wanted to be in a place where I was teaching first generation students and African-American students and working class students and Palestinian students, right? And so I went there. Now, it was too cold for me in Michigan, and the cold drove me out, right? But then I went to another institution that was really engaged, Occidental College, over places like Pomona, where there had not been a full-time African-American tenure track professor yet, right? I went to a place that was invested in community engagement and gave me resources to do that work. So I would just say, can we think about resources rather than stature? Can we think about where is there a match of values? Where do the institutional values match our own values, right? Because in some ways, Dr. Miller, I'm very much an institutionalist. For you to succeed, your work needs to be legible within the institution you want to work in. For you to succeed, and by success, I also mean for you to be able to enliven and use the resources of the institution to serve the community and the work that you want to engage in, that has to be legible to the institution. What does that mean? That means that you need to be able to articulate fully what is in it for your chair, dean, institution, right? I always say to people, you envision over somebody's head, what is in it for me, and speak to that question, right? And that question needs to also be about your values for it to be authentic, right? I'm not invested or interested in doing non-authentic work, right? I'm not interested in bullshitting my institution, right? Like, who wants to do that, right? You know? So, but we do have the agency to choose institutions that mirror our values and to articulate the places where those things overlap. And those are, I think, are the places where we can be most successful. Disaggregate stature from resources, time, and that will lead to sustainability and transformation in ways that are significant, I think. And it's work we're not taught to do, and they're questions I think we're not encouraged to ask.
Yeah, I always encourage my students to think that way, because everybody wants to be at an R1, and then they look at me and they say, but you, I said, but here's some other stories that I can tell you about people who did what you did, or did some work at colleges, got their 2 books done, and then thought about, because they had the resources to do that, and then thought about if they wanted to go to a Research 1 school. I always encourage students to do that because, they think you make it look easy. And, it's not. And there are other options that are great. So I'm glad to hear your story of your decisions, Gabrielle, because that's really meaningful to now have for people to hear from somebody who actually did it, rather than me tell a story and they say, yeah, but you did something else. Well, that was what was there. Like you said, it happened. I took it. Something else happened. I went and took it, but also with the idea that, hey, if this doesn't work out, I actually have skills I can use elsewhere. So I wasn't afraid. It wasn't going to be the end of my life, if this didn't work out, but I'm glad it did.
Yeah, I think it's great. I totally agree that disaggregating of stature and resource is a wonderful point. I just want to say that I think there are so many, to preserve our credibility here, in the sense that I think that there are so many people coming onto the job market who don't have a choice. They don't have multiple job offers. They can't actually choose the institution they're going to go to. The institution chooses them. And then sort of as if on the back foot, they have to accommodate themselves to an environment that may be more or less interested in them as a person or as a scholar. And yeah, you can do your yoga, and everybody needs to. But I think that lest we seem too privileged in our perspective, we have to take in the fact that some of the message we need to send out is really to the people who don't have choices, but are in less hospitable environments which they have to accommodate to.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I also think that we structure our choices. So there are lots of people who are applying to positions, but are not thinking about other kinds of positions, right? And to broaden the scope by engaging the resource, right, question, right, the multi-institutional question, the where can I get my work done question is one way to guarantee a broader set of options.
Well, and I also, with the very healthy reminder that the job market is very difficult for PhDs in humanistic fields, right? And so I think the question of what does that do in terms of the spectrum of following the work that one wants to do versus performing the expected required efforts, right? In other words, if you're a graduate student and your choice is between trying to publish articles on particularly specialized topics, which you feel like you can do if you must because it's the rules of the game, versus pursuing your work in whatever way it leads you, if the hole in the ceiling in terms of the job market is smaller and smaller, does that mean you should, do more of one or more of the other, right? I mean, some would say, well, given how difficult the job market is in many of our fields, you should do what you care about and figure out how the manifold ways that you can pursue that in your life, whatever. Or you could specialize and say, I'm going to bet on that horse.
I mean, we also need to think about resourcing our graduate students, right? So that they're not going into insane amounts of debt, right? And so that's one of the things we advocate for at my center. Our students are well resourced. And then there's the question too about what the job market means, right? We're talking about, it's a really hard job market. I think all three of us happen to be in fields where people don't just need to get academic jobs, right? We're sending folks in to be associate director of the Center for Digital and Online Learning, or the lead archivist for the Slavery Project in such and such library, right? We've got students who are going into work at the Smithsonian, students who are interested in and interning at in working for the National Endowment of the Arts, which, right, Dr. Jones did before she got her job, or the National Endowment of the Humanities. There are so many interesting places to do work that is intellectual work, right? Particularly if we believe what Dr. Miller said earlier, which is the monograph and the essay is not the way to reach the broadest number of people, right? The largest audience, to shift culture. And if that is so, there are lots of options for doing this work. Yes, the academy is in a period of restriction, and some say, and the humanities perhaps are in a time of crisis, right? But that's true in the academy. If we think about intellectual jobs, cultural jobs, right? Jobs in the thinking profession more broadly, and we train our students for that, and we encourage and celebrate our students when they succeed in these areas, and stop treating them, right, as if your job, James, is somehow less interesting than somebody who's a full professor and is doing conventional, right, monographs. I mean, like, come on, let's be serious. That's just not true, right? So, right, the job of, right, Dr. Miller's associate director, right? The job of being there are so many interesting jobs in that are part of the thinking profession, and perhaps they're in crisis too. But certainly they're also in need of transformation. And at this moment, right, where still on the boards of directors of cultural organizations are still something like 99.6 or 96.9, right, Anglo-American in the United States. They're also in need of the kinds of transformation that some of us in the room are also engaged in, right? That also needs our thinking power, our energy, right? And more people like Dr. Jones have been doing the work so other people don't have to bring hammers, right, to those institutions in the same kind of way. They need to bring their toolboxes, right? But they're not going to be the first generation of people who have been engaging folks who have been traditionally left out of conversations. And so I think that's also worth celebrating, right? There's work to be done, hard work to be done. But the academy is not the only place in which we can do it. Whoops.
Please.
I certainly agree. The academy is not the only place. But actually, I don't think we need to balance that phrase off with, being a professor is not so great. Being a professor is great. Being able to think whatever you want, to be an artist with ideas is a fantastic opportunity. I understand why people want it. It's also true, though, that, maybe the flip side of the kind of restriction that we're talking about is that maybe there'll be more professors who are more creative and more imaginative in the future, and people who otherwise went into the profession of being a professor, who might actually be better doing more shorter form work, because over the long form, maybe they're not as interesting as they are over the short form. There are other ways to take this and to focus in on the kind of minds that people have, the kind of intellectual creativity they have. I don't think we have a varied enough mapping of that spectrum. So we kind of channel everybody to a professor, and then there's the kind of remediation which started, I guess, the AHA a bunch of years ago when Tony Grafton had his Plan B that was all contested by different departments. It's not a failure to be a curator. It's not a failure to work in a museum or in a foundation. But there are different kinds of intellectual virtues that are preferred and valuable in these different ecosystems. And I think we just need to, this goes back really, Gabrielle, to what you're saying. It's similar to resource versus stature. We need better mapping of people's minds to people's destinations. And I don't think that people pay enough attention to their own minds. And I don't think we pay enough attention to the minds of institutions.
Well, mapping is one powerful metaphor, and I think legibility, which Professor Foreman brought up earlier, is another one, right? Obviously maps get better as you go more places. You have a map behind you. The first map doesn't have everything on it, right? And so I think the so Professor Foreman spoke earlier about when you're working on something strategically within your institution, you want your work to be legible to your department chair, your dean, the provost, the campus-wide committee. That active translation of communication of why one's work matters within the academic structures or outside of it, right? Whether it's academic adjacent, a library or museum, or whether it's further afield. Legibility of one's work never hurts, right? And sort of being able to both combine the idea of creating the legibility of your work and then the maps. How does the role of the person creating the legibility and the map that you were talking about, Professor Miller, the linking of map of one's mind and the map of the external environment, how do they connect?
I would say, if I can just start this conversation going, it has to start with self-knowledge. And that's not usually something that is stressed in most graduate programs, right? So you have to start with what are you in it for? How does your mind work? What are you good at? And work with that. It's not easy. Look, this is a challenge for every human being. There are people who want to do things that they're not suited for, and the things that they are suited for, they often dismiss as valueless because they're so good at it. This is not a trivial problem, and it's not only a problem for academia, right? It's a problem for human beings doing anything. But I think it does start there, because if we want to work through this in an efficient manner, as opposed to the kind of random happenstance that is mostly what life is, then we need to start with some self-knowledge.
I want to double down on that and just say yes to that statement, and to ask people to ask themselves this question: what energizes you and what enervates you? Because you can be good at a lot of things too, but you may not have time to do all the things you're good at. And there are some things that you're good at that other people can't do. And there's some things that you're good at that other people can do. And some of the things you're good at are not the things that energize you. And hopefully, and this isn't a question of privilege, right? There may become, whenever there is a point where you have the option to exercise doing the things that energize you rather than enervate you, that's one way of deciding, of facing that decision tree. The other thing that I would say about that is that Peter talked about self-knowledge, figuring out who you are and then who you need to work with or collaborate with based on those skills, and then valuing those skills, as he said, right? Valuing the skills you don't have that you bring to that you need in a collaboration is really, really important. And it is not easy, right? Because obviously you lean into your own style, but it's not the only style or set of skills that are needed to get certain kinds of larger projects done. And so figuring those things out are really important too. I ask people in workshops I facilitate to write a professional mission statement. What are your values, right? What is it that you choose with your feet, even though you think that you're about something else? Once you've got a certain number of years underneath, you'll know, like, I think that my writing is the most important thing, but I always choose to do these collaborative projects, right? When I'm faced with them. Then we've got to figure out a plan where we can meet the metrics so we can stay employed, right? So that that we can interact with our institution in whatever is the important way we want to, right? Or we need to in order to, I say, redirect resources, right? In ways that actually advance their goals. The other thing I would suggest too is figure out when we're dealing with institutions, requests are not things that institutions usually honor, right? They're not really interested in our own individual stories. Institutionally, I'm not talking about people, I'm talking about institutions. They are interested in how we can solve their challenges. And if in fact we can frame our work as a solution to their challenges, right? Not a personal request, a way to, I can help you solve your challenges, right? That's the way to frame our work. I think this is particularly important for first generation and folks of color who often come to institutions, and I'll speak for myself, I'm not speaking for everyone, I never try to do that. But many of us think, right, that if I ask for something, I'm in a position of being a beggar. That's not the right word, but a supplicant, right? And it is so much more powerful to figure out how the resources that you are asking for actually are helping the institution to solve shared concerns, shared problems. And so shifting our framework, right? Shifting our point of view through the lens of self-knowledge, right? And knowledge of the institution together is one strategy to get things done efficiently.
You remind me that in one of our focus groups for this Commission on Fostering and Sustaining Diverse Digital Scholarship, we were talking about how so much of the work of digital humanities is about working with communities outside the gates of the institution. And one of the historians in one of the sessions said, you know, it's not enough to fit in with like the broad institutional mission of being more community engaged, because we've all done that. We go and we say, my work is about this community, it's work, and they say, yeah, that's fine. She said, you have to fit in with one of the specific bullet points of the strategic plan. And so I think that's what you're saying, Professor Foreman, like, is be thinking, and that's part of the legibility argument, is like, where does your work really advance the institutional goals, and for better or for worse, right? I mean, those goals are not always, they're not looking to say, we're interested in you, we're interested in advancing this institution, and if you can align with us, you fit better. One of the questions that we've gotten in the chat from Professor Hurley Mara in Puerto Rico is pointing out that so much of this work is really difficult to, or so many of these pathways are difficult to access if you lack the elite institutional experiences, undergraduate, graduate. And so do people have thoughts on ways of broadening the access into this work, into the people who have the passions but don't have all the the doors that are available? And you've all talked about sort of making your own doorways in many ways, and changing institutions to recognize your work. But thoughts about making more doorways for all the people who don't fit the model of what fields, humanistic fields or elite institutions are sort of looking for?
I would just say, you have to expand. It's a numbers game, right? Like I said, my students say, oh, they want to be in a research one. But there may not be that opportunity now. You have to apply widely and also to different jobs, as Professor Foreman was saying. I think you have to look at your goal and then kind of see what is surrounding it to get there. It may be a longer pathway. It's not, people think it's like, I'm going to play the lottery, I'm going to win and be a millionaire. It's not that easy, right? Sometimes you have to think more broadly. Like myself, I had one goal, which was to get an advanced degree, to go back into the museum, and to have a better position. And when I got to the end of my studies, I decided actually I was going to try something else. And then I decided actually I didn't want to do that at all. So I think part of that, I understand about the differences in resources that the person is discussing, but I think you also need to think more broadly, because sometimes what you think you want along the way, something else presents itself that you hadn't even imagined was a job, was something you might be interested in, and it changes the game. And I think particularly in Puerto Rico now, in the Caribbean, but I'm thinking about Puerto Rico, I think there are certainly stateside, artists of the Caribbean are very important. You have more of that work being done in museums, also in the academy. Latinx artists, Latinx histories are very important. And I think there's a way to get there through many paths, if that's what you're interested in.
I think one of the things that's really interesting about the horrible turn, in my opinion, in relationship to what we call affirmative action, a remediation of many years of affirmative action for legacy kids and other communities that is now, is that we are focusing on the mythology of elite institutions, or at least, that's not the right word. That's actually not the right word. The limited number of people who go through elite institutions. And therefore their limited impact. And thinking through the fact that HBCUs, and I'm just going to read a recent tweet that I'm almost positive all of these numbers are right, that HBCUs have produced 40% of Black engineers, 50% of Black teachers, 60% of Black doctors, 80% of Black judges. Then they add, with a wink and a nod, 100% of Black vice presidents, 70% of Black veterinarians, 50% of Black nurses, right? We need to think about the ways in which we resource the institutions that actually have been producing excellence in our communities for many years. Excellence does not reside just in certain places. What are those numbers for Latinx serving communities and institutions, right? What are those numbers coming out? I grew up in California, where the junior colleges were extraordinary and sent so many people on to the UCs, right? After those 2 years at Santa Monica or Pasadena City College, for example. Those of us who have been grounded in New York know what CUNY meant, right? Why are we under-resourcing the public institutions that have produced and served generations of first-generation students, of Latinx students, of the students that the questionnaire, right, asked about? Why does the Supreme Court only go to certain institutions to get clerks, who then, of course, feed their own, right? Is the pathway on? This kind of question of elitism, and it is not as if, right, like going to those institutions doesn't set you up with a social network that will almost guarantee your success. I have been the beneficiary of that, right? But there are so many more people who have been the beneficiary of institutions that are public institutions that have produced a certain kind of excellence over years. And I think we need to really think about the ways in which we, and by we here, I mean all of the institutions with cultural power, advocate for the funding of public higher education in a way that we could double down on in significant ways.
Mr. Miller.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Kellie and Gabrielle both make very clear is that pathways through life are uncertain, and a lot can happen. We do tend to mythologize certain kinds of institutions as guaranteeing certain kinds of outcomes. And what I hear in the question is the flip side of that, which is fear and uncertainty that there won't be a reward to the effort. And I think there's no way to guarantee that. That's just part of the situation. I think one way to make it more visible, though, and less a kind of hidden fact, is if we thought about scholars as artists and the path of a scholar to some kind of endpoint as parallel to that of an artist, I think we would accept a much greater degree of risk in the profession. But as long as we think of it as a profession and not as a calling, the way we might think of an artist's calling, we expect a certain kind of relationship between investment and outcome. And that is where this goes awry, because we can't guarantee that. There's a huge investment that's required in higher education to get the higher education. And then there's no guarantee of a commensurate, satisfactory outcome. But you can't even get to the situation of being evaluated unless you put your heart into it and all of your resources. So I think getting out of any kind of expectation of a relationship between effort and reward is crucial. And if thinking about it as an artist's course through life is a way of doing that, then that maybe is a more useful or prudent way to go about this.
Dr. Miller, I always want to say amen to having being an artist as the analogy of my and many other people's lives, but being a starving artist is a different question entirely. And so I always want to bring us back to educational policy and to funding, right? So I came up at a time where there not only were more jobs, as you pointed out earlier, but there were Pell Grants, right? And Mellon was supporting, I had a 3 or a 4 year Mellon grant, which no longer exists. And tax policies didn't tax graduate student stipends, right? Which is a third of their stipend up literally up in smoke. And I came out with much less loans than students come out with now. And we have policies on the table nationally. And I know that there are people from other countries in the room with us. I want to respect that, right? But the United States is way out of line, right? In terms of what we expect students to take on as a risk as they create a life as an artist where they invest all of their resources, right? So it's a different thing to put all of your resources, all of your passion, all of your life into whatever it is you want to do without being guaranteed an outcome if you're $70,000 in debt. Or, of course, if those of us who have families that don't require that of us. And so we need national policies that undergird the risk taking, particularly in a moment when we're talking about a changing demographic. Of course, at the moment that we're talking about changing demographics, we're talking about students taking on the greatest amount of loans that for, only over the last 20 years, you couldn't write off, right? You could write off student debt 20 years ago. Now you can't, right? You write off credit card debt, can't write out student debt, right? So we can't punish the very people who are going into education through our policies, right? And shift the risk onto them. And that's a question of much broader educational policy than the ones that we're talking about today. But I really want to say what you said earlier, the boxes, right, look different when we're just looking at the questions of, right, graduate students, higher education, the boxes of the people that we are in this grid, and the larger kinds of questions of the policy, right, that contextualizes the kinds of choices we have and choices we make.
I only have two responsibilities as your host. One is difficult and one is easy. The difficult one is to say we're mindful of everyone's time and we need to bring this to a close. So that's the hard part, is stopping this conversation. The easy part is saying thank you. So thank you to all three of you for the time and for the energy and the curiosity and the passion, and for the broadening and ever broadening circles of this conversation. And thank you to our attendees who've joined us today. This will be up on the web soon. And we're very pleased that you all joined us.
Thank you, fellow panelists. Thank you, ACLS, for the invitation for us all to come together.
Thank you.